Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Nilanjan Sarkar, and I'm Deputy Director here at the South Asia Centre at the London School of Economics and Political Science. I'm delighted to welcome you this afternoon to the first event of our spring term, which is titled Sri Lanka 6 Months On. Um, I, we had a discussion on the 30th of October last year titled Sri Lanka Elections and Social Change, where we discussed the new elections, their results, and what expectations there were, how the success of the parties had been predicted or not predicted, and how it had worked itself out. And in many ways, the event this afternoon is a follow up on that, although it is focused more on the future and what challenges lie ahead for the country 6 months into into the new government, and we have an eminent sort of cross section of panelists. So we are going to get on very quickly with that. Now I can see in front of me that the live stream has somehow got blocked. So we're just going to quickly try and see what's happened to that, but I will continue with the introductions anyway. Before I come to that, I'd like to say a big welcome to all our members of our audience who are joining us from various time zones, and also to thank all of you for the incredible interest that you have shown in this event and written to us, to the South Asia Center's email, and I hope all of you have got the YouTube link. The event is happening via Zoom and is being live streamed on YouTube. For the audience, the chat function is enabled, so please ask your questions via the chat function. Please type them there. You're welcome to ask a question to an individual panelist. You're equally welcome to ask a question to the entire panel, and I will pose them to the panelists once they have made their initial comments and remarks. If you would like to tweet, then you can see the Twitter handles of the various speakers as well as the South Asia Center in front of you in the description of the event. Please do tag us. I should add here, especially for the benefit of those of you who have not attended any of the LSE events earlier or our online events, that had this event been happening on site at LSE, the LSE rules and regulations allow for a member of the audience to ask a question without revealing their identity or mentioning their name. In keeping with that spirit, when I pose questions that you type on YouTube, I will not be announcing your names. I'll simply be reading out the questions. Before I go on to introduce the speakers, I'm going to invite the director of our center, Professor Naufel Belkacem, to speak a bit about the event that's going to happen just now, the discussion. Naufel Belkacem is director of the LSE South Asia Center and professor of marketing at LSE. Naufel, please speak now. You need to switch on your mic.
Okay, everyone, thank you very much for joining us. And as Nilanjan said, I'm the director of the South Asia Center. I took it about a few days before the elections in Sri Lanka, and then I had the first event. I had very fortunate to be the first event that I was hosting was actually on Sri Lanka, and I'm originally from Sri Lanka, and so it was a nice coincidence at that time. So then we thought we should have some event about this time, but not take it as sort of a report card on the government, but ask what are the issues going forward. As Nilanjan said, what are the issues going forward? What are sort of some of the challenges that Sri Lanka is going to face? And therefore, how Sri Lanka should deal with them. So we got a good panel of people here who will cover different aspects of those challenges. And I think since we put this together, we have faced an additional challenge, which is the Trump tariffs. And also there is the conflict in India and Pakistan. The India-Pakistan conflict is not going to affect us directly so much as I think the Trump tariff would be. So we are going to have a discussion on the Trump tariffs, but not too much, but we will have a discussion and see what the implications are for a country like Sri Lanka. And therefore, I think we should now get going. And I think it's a opportunity for us to ask the question, as Nilanjan said, 6 months onwards, right? What are the challenges they're facing, and the government capable of actually meeting those challenges? That's the issue that we will have to address. And with that, let me pass it back to Nilanjan, who will then hand it to the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nofel. It's now my very pleasant task to introduce the panelists. We've had a brief discussion before we came live on air to decide the order in which the panelists would speak. Each panelist will make initial remarks for about 6 to 8 minutes, after which our discussant will take over and we'll carry forward with the discussion. Once again, you're very welcome to ask questions via the chat function, and I will pose those questions once the panelists have made initial remarks and once the discussion gets undergoing. Dr. Paikiasothy Saravanamuttu is an LSE alumnus. That's very important to say. We never forget that. And is founder and executive director of the Center for Policy Alternatives in Colombo. Harsha Amarasekera PC is a leading commercial lawyer and chairman Colombo Port City Economic Commission, alongside several other leading positions in the private sector. Farzana Haniffa is professor of sociology at the University of Colombo and member of Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. Our discussant this afternoon is Dr. Alan Keenan, who is senior consultant for Sri Lanka at the International Crisis Group here in London, where he coordinates and contributes to research, advocacy, and publications on Sri Lanka. Before I invite Dr. Paikiasothy Saravanamuttu to make his initial remarks, I should say that the event we had on the 30th of October last year, a recording of which is available on our website, included Professor Farzana Haniffa and Dr. Alan Keenan in that discussion as well. And they have been invited back so that we could have a connecting link between that event and this one. Dr. Saravanamuttu, please speak now. You have about 6 to 8 minutes. Thank you.
Well, first of all, let me thank the Center for inviting me to be part of this panel discussion. Now, we have a JVP-NPP government which won the presidential election, won a stunning victory in the general election, and now has held local government elections in which they have emerged as the single largest party. I think their success in those two elections, and perhaps even in the third one, was because their presidential candidate, who is now our president, Anura Kumara Dissanayake, has a personal following as well, and also because the electorate was very much into the whole idea of anti-corruption, that the ruling elite had been decrepit and corrupt. And the JVP tapped into that spirit of the Aragalaya, if you like, the mass movement that led to Gotabaya Rajapaksa being kicked out of office. And in that sense, they are the stewards of that new political culture. Nevertheless, in the election campaigns, they made a lot of promises with regard to moving out of the IMF shackles, as it were, and a number of promises with regard to a more people-oriented and people-sensitive economy. Now, 6 months into their government, and despite having an unprecedented majority in parliament, there isn't really a single piece of legislation that has been passed which will lead the country towards the economic vision that they outlined in these various campaigns. As a consequence, Anura Kumara won the presidential election with 43% of the vote on the first count. And in the general election, of course, it was a magnificent victory for them, of 61%. And then in the local government elections, it came again to 43%. The turnout in the local government elections, given that we have very high turnouts in Sri Lankan elections, was somewhat low. What is this attributable to? And I think that they have succeeded in asking people to come and make statements to the Criminal Investigations Department, and they have made a lot about their anti-corruption campaign. However, what we have not seen is the actual movement on, demonstrable movement on policy. When the JVP came into office, or indeed when their predecessors, Ranil Wickremesinghe, came into office, the social contract in this country was in tatters. And we have a number of fundamental questions that we need to answer on a number of fronts. And they are yet to tackle these questions. And there is this, I think, growing perception that the JVP was very skilled in opposition in terms of their communication, in terms of their critique and criticism of the powers that be. But once in government, things seem to be looking very different. The first point, of course, is that they said that they would go outside the bounds of the IMF framework, and that they did not do. And the argument was that it might have created a certain amount of political turmoil and whatever. So we are within an IMF framework, but an IMF framework which runs somewhat counter to their promises of greater subsidies. For example, Sri Lanka has 1.4 billion members of the public service. That is unsustainable for a population of 21 million. They're not saying anything about it. It's absolutely unsustainable. In fact, they're taking on another 30,000 public servants. In addition, we have state-run enterprises, including Sri Lankan Airlines, which are making millions of dollars of losses on a daily basis. They're not saying anything. They're saying they're just not going to privatize it. We have a whole raft of legislation that was passed by previous governments, from the Prevention of Terrorism Act to the Online Safety Act, all of which were very authoritarian and anti-democratic in terms of their outlook. Now, they have said that they were going to get rid of them, but 6 months into office, they have sent it into committee. In addition, there is the whole question of the Attorney General's Department, whereby that office advises and represents the government in court, but at the same time is the key agency for prosecuting potential offenders. There is an inbuilt conflict of interest. Again, that too has been put into committee. So it is a lot on promises, but very little in terms of actual performance, demonstrable performance. Now, we were told that 6 months after they came into office and after the local government elections were concluded, that they will get on with the business of governing. So in a sense, we're now holding our breaths to see what exactly is going to happen. Now, in terms of the future of Sri Lanka, I mentioned the point about the public service. I mentioned the point about the state-owned enterprises. But there are other issues as well. Let's take the sort of geopolitical dimension. The JVP as a political party has historically been the most anti-Indian political party in Sri Lanka. However, after these various agreements have been signed with India, this government has brought Sri Lanka much, much more into what I would call the economic orbit, or not just the economic orbit, the orbit of India, because there is a defense dimension to it. Those agreements have not been made public. They haven't been presented to Parliament either. But we are slowly getting caught up in the India-China rivalry, and we're being caught up on the side of the Quad. That is, of course, India, the United States, Japan, Australia, whatever. So our pretensions of being non-aligned will therefore demand very adept diplomacy on the part of the government, which unfortunately they don't show signs of having at the present moment. Now, when you think about the next 10 to 15 years, for example, there is every possibility, as everyone says, that India will be the third largest economy in the world. We all know that the southern states of India have been the real motor, the engine of that growth. In Sri Lanka, the development projects may well be in the north and east of the country. And it would be very silly and stupid of us, I think, to turn our backs on that exponential growth that India might well achieve. What is the rest of Sri Lanka going to do if the north and east of the country gets drawn willy-nilly into that economic orbit of India? That's one question. Second question is, and let me add, the new Lok Sabha will have to decide on delimitation in India, and given the delimitation is primarily done on the basis of population, the states of North India or outside the south of India will get more seats. This may well fuel a demand in the states of southern India to move to confederation, not secession, confederation. That's one thought to park in terms of the future with regard to Sri Lanka. When I said that they are in committee and not seen to be doing policies, what I meant here was largely with regard to the economic question. The day-to-day economic trials and tribulations are quite substantial. They have to tell their own constituency the hard truth about whether they can provide the subsidies, whether they can provide the welfare-oriented policies that they talked about at the election campaign and still remain within the IMF framework. That I don't think is going to be possible for them. Then there is the question of growth. Into the future, where is growth to come from? Today, we have been sustained by tourism and indeed by migrant labor that we have sent out to the Middle East and elsewhere. There are remittances. Where is that to go? We have root and branch reform as far as the education sector is concerned, because we must become more digitalized. We are unlike other South Asian states in that we are an aging economy. And as a consequence of all the economic trials and tribulations, we've had more and more people go out in terms of forming a part of a diaspora. So we have very, very serious questions that we need to ask. And last but not least, in the general election, the JVP did secure seats in the north and east, but it seems to have reverted back to type, if you like, as far as local government elections, where the local Tamil parties have come back. So overall, I am still concerned that the JVP won't get this right, because there are the hard fundamental questions that they have to pose to what is essentially their own constituency. The opposition, if anything, is what is going to keep them in power, because the opposition is in shambles at the present moment. They have to deal with the dissent within their own constituency if they are to be able to govern without political turmoil. Of course, the very sort of extreme thing is that you could get another Aragala, and it might turn the previous Aragala into a tea party, in that it might be more internecine warfare between the JVP and that wing of the JPB in 1988-89, who broke off and have formed the Frontline Socialist Party. So at the present moment, it looks like the JVP-NPP government is a classic embodiment of that sort of cliche that, look, when you're campaigning for office, things look very different than when you are in office. So it's now time in the next 6 months, which I think will be crucial for this government, to get on with the question of governing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saravanamuttu. That was very, very interesting to hear as opening remarks from you, and I'm sure we will come back to some of it, not least the two very important points you make at the very end. One is about political parties remaining in power because opposition is not properly and fully and effectively organized. And the other is also the fundamental difference between canvassing for elections based on issues and actually trying to address them when one is in power and one has actually got the political position to do so. But I'm sure we'll come back to a lot of this. Our next speaker is Harsha Amarasekera PC, who is a leading commercial lawyer and chairman of the Colombo Port City Economic Commission, alongside several other leading positions in the private sector. Please speak now. You have about 6 to 8 minutes.
Thank you, Nilanjan, and I am privileged to be a part of this very distinguished panel. Firstly, as was said, Sri Lanka is at the tail end, or shall I say even at the beginning, of a fairly remarkable recovery after the economic crisis of 2022. The country has recorded a GDP growth of around 5% in 2024, and its reserves have increased to a sum of around USD 6 billion as we speak now. Though we projected a growth rate of about 4 to 5% over the last couple of months, I think it has been projected to be somewhat lower during the coming year, particularly by reason of the Trump factor that Professor Naufal referred to. But going back to the election and the expectations and the promises that were met, as a private sector entity and a person involved in the private sector, one of the great fears was whether the NPP and the president of Anura Kumara Dissanayake would actually shift away from the IMF program. Because there was a real apprehension that if one were to shift away from the IMF program, then you were going to derail whatever the recovery that was on its way. There was also the apprehension that there would be a significant escalation or de-escalation of the then stable economic situation as one saw it. The parity between the LKR and the dollar would soar, interest rates would go through the roof, private sector would find it difficult to coexist, the SMEs would find it difficult to source the funding, and the stock exchange largely would also suffer. And as you know, in this country, as in many countries, the stock exchange is the barometer of the confidence in the government and of the business community. So in that light, the exchange rate at the time of the presidential election was about LKR 300. And I know many companies bought forward exchange contracts, anticipating the dollar moving forward, 315 to 330. And by the time the general elections came, which was 2 months after the election of the president, the dollar actually came down to 293. And even as we speak today, it's at 296. Similarly, the interest rates, which were seen by the economists as spiraling up and would bring real pressure on the economy, the AWPLR, which was about 9.1% prior to elections, is now at an all-time low of 8.39%. So the perception of what an NPP government would do to the economy in the real terms, in terms of the exchange rate and in terms of the interest rates, has not really materialized. And that has been, in my view, the single biggest confidence booster to the private sector in terms of economic growth and its planning. Side by side is the fact that they stayed within the IMF program. And they were able to complete the DDR, the debt restructuring, that was set in motion prior to the election of the president and the general election. It took some time Ideally, it should have been done maybe a month or two previous to when it was done, but it was done. So for the first time in over 3 to 4 years, we have a stable government and for the moment, a financial stability in the sense for the next 3 years, we know where we stand before the debt repayments have to recommence. Now, that is what one needs to aim for. And that is what the journey from now to then should be made of. So when we are talking about where are we 6 months from now, I agree with Dr. Paikiasothy. There is two questions really that we should ask ourselves. In the context of the expectations of the private sector in Sri Lanka, which has been the engine of growth, no matter which government was in power, it has shown tremendous resilience in the past. It will show resilience now, and it will continue to be the engine of growth in the future. What were their expectations pre-elections, and have they been founded to be correct or not post-elections and in the months ahead? And towards that end, I think one of the clearest barometers has been the Colombo Stock Exchange. Much to the surprise of many, an NPP is not one who was advocating free market economy or where the stock exchange would be, the turnover would be going up on a daily basis or the index would be going up. The turnover went up from 14 billion in August of 2024 to 57 billion before the general elections. That's between the 2 months, between the presidential and the general. And by December and January, had hit 140 billion a day, a month. So we are talking about some form of investor confidence in what they perceive as where Sri Lanka is going. And this is all dependent on the quarterlies and the results that may be coming out of the quoted entities, mostly led by the banks and the DDR that was entered into and others. If one were to then consider the tourist arrivals that has continued to go up month on month and taken together with the remittances that have continued to go up without resorting to the Hawala system, and this is important. The exchange rate stability is the counter to the Hawala system operating. And the fact that the remittances are now coming through the official channels is an indication of that one factor.
Mr. Amarasekera, I should ask you to explain the Hawala system in one sentence.
Yes, Hawala system is whereby our expatriate workers, as well as some of the exporters, would resort to a system outside of the official banking channels to bring in their foreign exchange to Sri Lanka and then convert that into the local currency. And this is in large part what led to the shortage of the foreign reserves in post-crisis, which led to the bankruptcy and the shortage of fuel and medicine and food post-Aragale or pre-Aragale. So these are all factors that in one way or another is a measure of the people's confidence that in some way something is happening and it is on fast track. I know I'm taking a little bit more, 1 minute more, and I will stop at this. From 3 seats, the NPP went up to 159 seats. They have a 2/3 majority in parliament. And they are in a position, I feel, to pass any piece of legislation they so want. But as a private sector entity, in some way, I have been associated with some of the forums by which they are taking stock of what is on the ground and having a consultative dialogue with the private sector in what steps should be taken to address some of these needs, including subsidies for agriculture, as well as in the importation of necessary pharmaceuticals, etc. So in one word, going to consultation while it delays is also a process of governance, in my view, notwithstanding the majority that they have in parliament, by which they can pretty much ram any legislation through parliament. But I'm in agreement full with Dr. Paikiasothy. Action needs to be taken quickly. I think the time of reflection, consolidation, and consultation has come, where now there is the real time to see the economic activities taking place, so that growth can also take its turn and come to its spurt. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Amarasekera. Once again, you've raised several very important points and also shown the positives. Since Dr. Saravanamuttu and Mr. Amarasekera both referred to it, it is unlikely that any of our viewers who are watching, the international audience, will not know this if they are interested in Sri Lanka. But the Aragalir refers to the protests that happened in 2022, especially in the summer of 2022. It literally means the struggle, eventually leading to the fall of the Rajapaksa government. Our next speaker is Professor Farzana Haniffa. Professor Haniffa, welcome back. Professor Haniffa is Professor of Sociology at the University of Colombo and a member of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. Please speak now. You have about 6 to 8 minutes. You need to put your microphone on.
Apologies. Good evening, and thank you very much for inviting me, Nilanjan. So I have a few thoughts written down, and let me just read that. Okay. Now, the existence of a people-friendly government committed to reform after a period of rampant corruption, dismantling of institutions, state violence, and the targeted cultivation of ethnic hatred is quite something that we are slowly getting used to and still amazed by. And 6 months into its term, the government is now entrenched and getting set for the long haul. We've just had local governments, as Dr. Saravanamuttu just explained, the local government elections, which, while not fantastic for the sitting government, as in not a blank check, not a landslide like the parliamentary election victory, but still a perfectly adequate showing. The government won 44% of available seats, and the largest number of seats to any single party in at least 222 of the 339 bodies, and overall control of about 150 or so bodies. They managed to win the largest number of seats in the Colombo Municipal Council that has been UNP dominated for generations. The government representatives have refuted claims regarding minorities moving away from them by highlighting the inroads they have made into the councils in the north. Given that they have never contested in the north, they consider their achievements in the north quite adequate and even commendable. The disarray, as Dr. Saravanamuttu also explained, in which we find the opposition parties, is further evidence of the fact that the government is still massively popular and that they remain secure. And while noises are being made regarding an opposition takeover, the possibility of all opposition parties coming together seems somewhat unlikely. Today's reporting of the fissures within the parties competing for the position of mayor for the Colombo Municipal Council is indicative of the disarray. The main opposition party, the Samagi Jana Balawegaya, is arguing internally regarding who will be put forward as their mayoral candidate. However, all is by no means rosy. The government has had a long-held position that their brand of politics is better for the minorities than the identity politics that minority communities have long engaged in. While this may prove true in the long run, it is not yet the case. And the government representatives' complacency with regards to their position regarding minorities and their superiority and virtue signaling actions with regards to their quote-unquote clean politics has been shown up in this election. While the government's commitment to not weaponizing ethnopolitical difference is a huge plus for the country's future, their position of paying only the most perfunctory attention to the country's long history of ethno-nationalist politics also creates significant blind spots. One such blind spot was made evident recently in their treatment of a Muslim youth pasting anti-Israel stickers at a shopping mall in Colombo. The youth was arrested under the PTA, the Prevention of Terrorism Act. The president was persuaded to sign a detention order, and after several weeks, Sorry. Yes. After several weeks of pressure from the public, he was released with severe restrictions on his movement, despite there being no case against him. The restrictions on his movement were again done with a restriction order signed by the president. The government's own understanding of the issue through spokesperson statements and comments by various actors, as well as the numerous statements from the authorities, were troubling. They revealed only that the arrest and detention of this young man, with no case against him, was done following the same principles of pathologizing all aspects of Muslim life as practiced by the previous regime. The practice of permitting authorities to arrest without adequate grounds other than what is deemed suspicious behavior, and then building a case to justify the arrest, was done in this instance as well. This method was practiced in the case of many Muslim individuals in the aftermath of the Easter bombings, almost all of whom were later released. This process is also the modus operandi of the authorities under the PTA. These are all carryovers of our history of ethno-religious politics, and the government's refusal to see this history as relevant today only seems to be institutionalizing many of these practices further. There could be many such issues, and the government needs to be cognizant of this blind spot and its consequences going forward. The fact that their post-election analyses in Parliament did not, even in one instance, indicate that they were aware of and plan to address the possible blind spot regarding minority representation and politics is concerning, and the accusation of arrogance by a variety of commentators is warranted. Again, these issues should be viewed in their context. This position is taken by a government, as stated earlier, that has committed to not consciously weaponizing ethnic difference, and that is hugely important. The government needs to be persuaded to look at this and other blind spots that it may have, taking this stated position of inclusiveness into consideration. While there are many problems, there is also a lot that is positive that has happened in the first 6 months. The social protection measures in the recently passed budget, the rolling out of education reforms for secondary education as early as next year, the commitment to strengthening the public sector, the commitment to reforming higher education, the establishment of an independent prosecutor's office, etc., are very important and positive developments. Many more such measures are being anticipated, and it is to be seen how many of them can be realized. Currently, civil society in the country does not seem adequately committed to a project of engaging positively with the government to ensure that it delivers on its commitments. Civil society organizations used to an oppositional politics has not figured out our responsibilities in the context of a government that is committed to a lot of the issues that we want pushed forward. Political forces that we know are not committed to a project of progressive governance are waiting in the wings, and we will lose a rare historical opportunity if we do not push and perhaps support and enable this government to keep to its commitments. This obviously does not mean that we endorse everything that they do, but we must build mechanisms and creatively imagine processes through which we can work with them to ensure that the change we want through this government is realized. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Alan. Dr. Alan Keenan is Senior Consultant for Sri Lanka at the International Crisis Group here in London, where he coordinates and contributes to research advocacy and publications on Sri Lanka. Alan has very kindly agreed to be discussant for this event. So Alan, you're going to have more time than the others, so you can make your own comments and then begin the discussion. We have one question that's come in, and there's an open invitation to everyone viewing this event on YouTube to please ask questions via the chat function. But Alan, please go ahead now.
Great. Well, thank you for inviting me, Nilanjan. It's a pleasure to be here to see some of my old friends and to meet Mr. Amarasekera I've never met before. And I have enjoyed your short presentations, and I will try to weave a few thoughts about what you guys have already said into some other notes that I had already prepared. So I think echoing a little bit of what Farah said, I think the exhaustion and delegitimization of Sri Lanka's established political parties and really the political class as a whole that followed the economic crisis and the popular uprising, the Aragalaya of 2022, created an unprecedented political opening, which we then saw seized upon by Anura Kumara Dissanayake and his national People's Power Alliance in their twin victories in 2024, which which then sort of opened the door with a 2/3 majority to do pretty much what they wanted if they could figure that out. And I think, though, what I'm picking up from my own analysis for a paper I'm finishing for a crisis group, but also from what you guys have just said, the window of opportunity of reform is fleeting. So they've had 6 months. I think there's growing impatience, frustration, but still a lot of hope among a significant chunk of Sri Lankan population that they can achieve some of their very ambitious agenda. But the window is slowly beginning to close, as political windows inevitably do. I think Dr. Saravanamuttu is right that the NPP has really not yet made a lot of the big choices they have to make. And I think this dovetails with what I was preparing to talk about. So I think they've yet to really choose their sort of economic vision beyond simply managing the IMF agreement. They don't yet have a longer-term economic strategy that can bring both growth and, crucially from the NPP's perspective, equity, or at least less inequity. They've not yet really chosen how to deal with the national security state, as sort of enacted or sort of played out through the Prevention of Terrorism Act or the Online Safety Act or the continued military surveillance and tight control over the Tamil and Muslim areas of the North and the East. Nor have they, crucially, really figured out their position on refashioning the state in more inclusive ways that can address longstanding Tamil and Muslim concerns, but of course in a way that the Sinhala and Buddhist majority can accept. Ideally through a new constitution, but preceding that through some kind of through the reactivation of the provincial councils in the North and the East in particular. So all of those issues have really been so far kind of put on hold, talked about, promised, but not yet pursued. And I think the way I've been thinking about that is that the NPP is sort of faced with the very nature of the NPP, part through its complicated relation with the JVP, sort of faces a series of internal contradictions or sort of dilemmas that their particular contingent sort of political development has brought them. So in terms of the economy and the constraints that they face as a relatively poor country that's recently, emerging from bankruptcy in an international financial system that is weighted in favor of powerful states, they've decided to take the course of pragmatism, surprising some by just how pragmatic they've been. Some, who had thought that given the Marxist sort of anti-global financial system ideology of the JVP, that they would be less amenable or less cooperative with the IMF agreement. In fact, they've embraced it wholeheartedly, quite enthusiastically, and are implementing it virtually to the letter, with a few exceptions, a few sort of controversial points about electricity prices and so forth. But this bought them some time, but it brings them some serious political and even economic challenges, I think, or risks. So I think there's the risk that Dr. Saravanamuttu has mentioned of not delivering to their constituency, not delivering the economic relief that many people had hoped for, at least in the short term. But there's also another less discussed risk, which I think is the risk from the fact that, as I read it, and as certain other economists and financial analysts who know a lot more than I do, the risk that the IMF agreement and its definition of debt sustainability has offered Sri Lanka only a very modest amount of debt relief. So that at the end of the program, the IMF program, are still estimated to have something like a 95% debt to GDP ratio, which is quite high. So the amount of debt relief that's been offered through the IMF program may prove to be inadequate to handle the debt repayments that will start coming fully due in a few years. And what I would say is my suggestion would be that the international creditors, international institutions like the IMF and individual creditor states should really be open to the NPP's suggestion when they were campaigning of doing an independent, up-to-date debt sustainability analysis that would give us a more realistic sense about where the government is likely to be at the end of the IMF program and what might be needed to give it the kind of debt relief that would really produce a sustainable, realistically sustainable amount of relief. I think the government's decision to abandon this idea of doing its own debt sustainability analysis was a mistake and should be reconsidered. And I think its international partners should be open to reconsidering it. So that's a set of issues around the sort of managing the economy and sort of addressing its different constituencies, the sort of international constituencies, the reality of the international economic governance, but also the needs of so many Sri Lankans who are really still suffering economically. Sort of dilemma 2 is, this will be a little bit shorter. The NPP won because of its outsider status in large part. It was not implicated directly in sort of the systems of corrupt governance, of oppressive and repressive state that all the other parties had been over the years involved in and helped create. This gave the NPP appeal and opened up a real chance of making changes, particularly with respect to corruption, but also with respect to other ways that the state functioned in undemocratic and problematic ways. But on the other hand, their outsider status also can be seen as inexperience, right? They have not had the experience running the state. And what we're seeing over the first 6 months is that experience is quite helpful. And that, as a lot of people have pointed out, the NPP has often appeared amateurish, sort of overwhelmed by, having to face issues that they're not really fully equipped to do. And they've not been able to sort of take control of the state machinery, I think, in ways that are yet adequate to achieving their very ambitious agenda. I think related to this, I think we can also see a dilemma or a contradiction around the government's promise of a clean Sri Lanka and its very moralized critique of corruption. So the self-presentation that the NPP is a sort of a different entity, promising and in trying to fashion a new political culture that's fundamentally different from the corrupt established parties. Now, that is very appealing politically, and I think helped get them elected. But it also feeds, as I think others have pointed out, a very problematic partisanship, a kind of sense that we're better, an arrogance, we're better, we really know how to do things. We're not going to deal with these guys who have ruined things and have stolen your money and, abused their power. But this, I think, especially say, for instance, in terms of the local government elections and the fact that many local governments do not have a majority controlled by one party, that partisanship brings with it, loses opportunities of positive collaboration and of really fashioning a new political culture in a sense of, so I guess what I'm trying to say is the NPP is promising a new political culture, but the culture of partisanship is deeply rooted in, it is essential to Sri Lankan political culture as to lots of other countries. But they're not really addressing that. In fact, they're fully part of, to date at least, that partisan political culture. So if they want to change the political culture, that would be one thing to try to do. So I think the government will need to be encouraged to prioritize and to resist their politics of moral righteousness and be more open to criticism and to offers of collaboration, including from civil society, from established sort of more liberal internationalist civil society, which I think has a lot of resources for the NPP, but which has been kept, from what I can see, at an arm's length by the NPP and the JVP, who in some sense have their own civil society that they think is more, perhaps more genuine or more attuned to their priorities. Finally, echoing, I think, a lot of what Dr. Haniffa has said, I think the NPP faces a fundamental set of sort of contradictions or dilemmas around nationalism, ethnic, religious diversity, and the state. Now, to date, I think the NPP has shied away from any confrontation, even a very gentle one, with Sinhala Buddhist nationalism, which has shaped the Sri Lankan state over many decades. And you can see this on their really avoiding any real engagement with the continued land grabs in the north and the east, which Dr. Saravanamuttu's Center for Policy Alternatives has written a long and detailed report about. land grabs often facilitated by the archaeology department or by the military or involving Buddhist monks who see their task as sort of preserving the singular Buddhist heritage of the North and the East. So the NPP government has really not touched this, has not done anything to even enforce the law as ordered in a number of cases by courts, in court cases raised by Tamil and Muslim landowners or temple managers, temple trustees. We've also seen them not do anything really to tackle the longstanding issue of the aggressive surveillance of Tamil civil society and also Muslim civil society in the North and the East. We've seen them really not take a clear position on the future of provincial councils, no mention of the 13th Amendment, and really, so far, not really much of a plan for when the new constitution will begin to be discussed and drafted, and how it will address these longstanding issues of creating a more inclusive state that is a state that can be embraced and seen as representing all communities, not just Sinhalese and Buddhist. So just finally, I think this raises a question of, all of these in some sense raise a question of who is the NPP? Now and what is their relation to the JVP, which is a question that will take a long time really to get worked out in practice, I think. But in the case of nationalism, I think the question is, and I think this echoes something that Farah wrote quite a few months ago now, there's a tension between the national people's power still rather abstract vision of non-discrimination, of equal citizenship, of unity with diversity on the one hand, and the JVP's still deeply entrenched attachment to a unitary state and to state security. And I think until they work out internally the relationship between those different strands of thinking, I think we won't, we have to wait for that to be sorted out. And hopefully the government can be nudged by various partners, international and domestic, and actors who want them to succeed in their very ambitious reform program, to begin to address that tension in ways that really do help fashion a more inclusive and equitable Sri Lankan state. So I'll leave it there. Thanks for listening.
Sure. Thank you very much. Nofel, did you want to come in and ask something, and then we'll just go around and ask everyone to respond to some of the things Alan has said, or as much to what others have said. But Nofel, did you want to say something at this point? No. So shall we just, how should we do this now? We have a few questions, but Farah, would you like to respond to some of the things Alan said? Shall we start from you and then come to Dr. Saravanamuttu?
Sure. So let me ask the questions that I had, right?
Sorry.
So, yeah,
sorry. If you could
the first issue is the IMF agreement, right? One of the issues in the IMF agreement was that Sri Lanka tax revenues as a percentage of income or expenditures was very low. And they wanted it brought up to a certain level of percentage. Now, if you take a percentage, means there's a numerator and a denominator. Right, the numerator is the amount of tax you raise, and the denominator is the full amount of revenues that you're spending. And that percentage had to go up. Now, the previous government under Ranil Wickremesinghe focused entirely on the numerator. Right, he just taxed everybody, including lots of people who could hardly afford to pay any taxes, in order to bring it to the IMF level. Now, there was some expectation that this new government would actually focus on the denominator, cut back on the expenditures. So if you keep the taxes at a certain level, you cut back on your expenditures, then you can actually bring your ratio up. But that doesn't seem to have happened. And why, right? So that might be, and in fact, as Farah said, they're even thinking of increasing the number of government servants' employment. So that's one question that I had. And maybe one of you can answer that question. Any one of you could answer that question. The second question is the Trump tariffs, right? Now, if you remember the famous chart that Trump put up, now it has been discredited completely. But nevertheless, in that chart, on the first page was Sri Lanka. I don't know whether you all noticed that, right? That Sri Lanka was on that chart. And that chart is really worthless for whatever it is, but it still put us on the map there. And the question is, what's the impact of those Trump tariffs if he ever comes to actually implementing this sort of reciprocal taxation agreement? At the moment, Sri Lanka will have to pay 10%, right? From some of them would have been 0. That's going to make a little bit of a challenge, but not as high as 30 or 40% or something that he had on his chart. So any sort of idea on how the government is going to deal with that and what the private sector is actually going to do about it? Okay, those are the two questions I had, and anybody can take the first one and the second one. You can answer it in any order you would like. Thanks.
Mr. Amarasekera, would you like to start with?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that.
I mean, put very simply, if you can just be direct and keep your answers brief, we can go around and then come back to you. But essentially, is whether this government would act on the denominator, and the other is the Trump tariff.
Yeah, so two things very shortly. The government of Ranil Wickremesinghe just went on the basis of taxation.
Okay.
So government revenue is either from taxation or from imports. By reason of the currency crisis, we could not permit imports. The moment you permitted the imports, there was outflow of foreign currency, and therefore you cannot then afford that. So this is the tightrope that we are walking on. So for the first time now, not for the first time now, the taxation denominator at the lower end has been widened, so that there is some form of relief at the bottom end where the tax slabs have been increased somewhat, so that the poorest of the taxpayers who are paying that tax threshold has got some form of relief. There is also the lowering of a little bit of VAT on some products, but not all. But what has happened now is the opening of vehicle imports. And that is where a significant amount of import tax against that is expected this year. So are we going to be able to sustain the revenue targets that they anticipated at the beginning of the year by those measures alone? Only time will say. Even as we speak, there are some commentators saying that the government expected X billions from the import of vehicles. It is not yet come to pass. But that is because the LCs get open only when the vehicles get ready for shipment. So much of this is commentary. But nonetheless, there is now, with the easing of the import ban, a new revenue stream coming in, which was hitherto for the last 2-3 years not available. Whether that alone will suffice to lower the taxation is yet to be seen. But you're right, Naufal, the expenditure vis-a-vis the government must also be brought down. And that's the other dichotomy that we are facing. Because for internal growth, in the past, government was the key mover because there were government projects taking place that propelled the economy. By reason of the very tight fiscal space that is there is no government projects going on. And as a result, also, there is significantly less tax revenue coming from those sectors, both in terms of VAT and others. Nonetheless, withholding tax is still there. So that tax is being collected at source. And several other measures have been taken to collect the tax at source, which opens the way for there to be a steady stream coming in, which was one of the downfalls under the Rajapaksa regime that led to the deficit being created. I don't know whether I answered any part of that question, but in brief, those are two of the issues that we are facing at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Yes, you did. But I mean, we can always come back to for more details. Since I had asked Professor Haniffa to speak, would you speak now, please? And then we'll come to you, Dr. Saravanamuttu. Professor Haniffa, there is a question for you as well. So if you respond to what Alan was saying, then I'll pose the question to you.
I think Alan is quite right in the sense of, the NPP has really not taken on the difficult questions, right, of the North and East, the ethnic issue, the military, all of those things are still sort of baiting, and I suspect it's also because of the the 3 elections that have happened almost back to back, right? But I am concerned that they are sort of thinking in relation to the consequences, like I said, of our sort of history of ethnic conflict and all of that is not thought through in any substantive way, right? And that for me is the biggest problem in terms of how they might resolve these issues. So yeah, but I mean, still I feel that the commitment to not weaponizing difference is huge. And if things are done on that principle, I think we can see some progress. But I think the government needs to figure out how it's going to negotiate with the military, for instance, right? And the sort of the security establishment in general, the TID, CID, all of that. And that's going to be a huge thing that, I haven't seen any sort of positive indicators of how they might deal with that. I can only hope, actually. And it's like a very serious statement. Yeah. I mean, in terms of the question.
Yeah, I'll just read out the question to you is, could Professor Haniffa say more about how minority representation in politics could be improved?
Yeah. So, I mean, the fact that there is no, say, Muslim representative in the cabinet, I've written about this, right? It's huge. And sort of given the fact that for the past decade or so, Muslims have had a bit of a hard time with regards to representation, with regards to, how the government perceives them. They are now sort of in a tizzy in relation to how one accesses the government, is able to speak with the government, is able to be heard by the government, right? And there's no sort of way other than through 2 very minor representatives within the government. Right? We have a deputy speaker, and then there's a 1 member of parliament that they speak to get their idea, to get some kind of sort of like hearing from the government, right? And that is really not adequate. I mean, this is also to do with the way in which sort of Muslim engagement with political entities has been sort of has emerged in the past 10 years, right? And it emerged in the context of a really huge anti-Muslim movement that was endorsed by the state in power, right? So in this context, Muslims are only talking about sort of a very kind of, a very committed position of identity politics, right? And so that's not going to work with the NPP. So it's really an impasse. It's really troubling, and it's a real problem, right? So that is sort of what I was trying to talk about as well. But I mean, in terms of what how to address these issues, I mean, I think there has to be some realization on the part of the NPP that this is actually a problem, right? And not, I mean, I see them reducing this problem to, Muslims only thinking about themselves, Muslims are sort of always self-obsessed, that kind of rhetoric, right? And this for me is a real problem again of the NPP not having the wherewithal to actually have an analysis of, what we have encountered for the past decade. And what should be done therefore going forward, right? I mean, this is not to say that that it's very good on other minority issues with regards to the Tamil population, for instance, in the North and East. I mean, as Alan said, they have not done much. So these are all concerns. I mean, not really a direct answer to the question of what I suggest, but I think the NPP needs to sort of broaden its analysis of what is going on.
Okay, great. Dr. Saravanamuttu, thank you for your patience. Would you like to respond to the 2 things that Nofel mentioned about focusing on denominator and Trump tariffs? And then I have a question for you.
Well, yes.
Or even to some of the things that Alan said.
Yeah. Okay. I think I agree with a lot of the things that Alan has said. I have been saying very similar things as well. When you look at Sri Lanka today, in terms of government and governance, where does the real power lie? There are 158, bar the Speaker, 158 members of parliament that are from the NPP-JVP alliance. And there is President Anura Kumara Dissanayake, who has presented himself very much as a pragmatist. But I think the real structure of power lies with the General Secretary of the JVP, and the JVP Politburo. We had local government elections, and everyone is hailing them as a great success. But, constitutionally, local government comes under provincial councils. The structure of power is very, very centralized. This is a political formation that talked about transparency and accountability very, very lucidly and all of that when it was in opposition, but it's one of the most opaque governments that we've had so far. Do we know who is actually making these decisions? Now, they are not responsible for everything. I mean, when it comes to taxation, for example, I've always believed that we have successive governments have nurtured, because of their populism, they've nurtured a culture of entitlement amongst the population at large. You have free education, free health, and then you get a job in the public service where there are no KPIs. No one has ever been sacked from the public service as such. So you're looked after from womb to tomb. Yes, the taxation system, all of a sudden, we were one of the lowest tax-paying countries in the world. All of a sudden, we were shocked by what was done. But surely, this government needs to go out and talk to its constituency, because it's largely now its constituency, and tell them what the sacrifices are. I refer to the 1.4 billion members of the public service. That is absolutely unsustainable. If we don't do anything about that, we will go back for another IMF loan. And the conditions will be more stringent. The IMF has just announced that the tax concessions that we've made with regard to the Colombo port city need to be revoked. Male is going to be a hub as well. In addition, we have the port that has been set up by the Adanis in Kerala. Colombo port was dealing with some 70% of the midshipment with regard to India. That will go back to India. We have some very, very tough questions which we have to deal with. And I don't see anything that this government is doing to address them. As yet, they talk about a rural economy. Now, we are in the 21st century. Look at the agricultural sector. 27% of our labor force is employed in the agricultural sector. And what is the return to GDP? 7%. We are talking big about the 5% or whatever it is. But we do know that if we are to get out of this mess and push for growth, we have to get 8% at least. And if we are going along this 5% route, we are going to take another 20, 30 years to get out of this. Now, you have a political party in power with an unprecedented majority. I would have thought that in the first 6 months, or indeed in the remaining 6 months of their first year in office, they would go and talk the truth to the people, because only they can. They are from the people very much so. This whole anti-establishment talk and all of that, So my disappointment, if you like, is people say, look, they're inexperienced, they've never been in power, they have their own notions of what civil society constitutes and all of that kind of thing. But they're in government now. They're the government of the country. They need to pinch themselves and tell themselves that they're in power. What is the impression that you get? That, look, they never expected to be in government. They probably never expected to get that over 2/3 majority that they got. So what are their plans? In the campaign, they said, for example, that they would get rid of the PTA. The OSA, the Online Security Act, would be got rid of. We had a meeting with the minister that was responsible for all of these things, plus the whole question of reforming the Office of the Attorney General. And I don't think I'm in any way sort of compromising him when he said, look, I'm just one person. I agree with you. What is the NPP? The NPP was the JVP rebranding itself to make people try and forget about what happened in 88, 89. Who are these NPP members of parliament? What are they doing? Do they actually have any power? So there are still tough questions. You know, we can sit down and say, look, yes, they're inexperienced and we've got to give them time. But mollycoddling them in that way is not going to help the country. We had the worst crisis, economic crisis that we had. We have to start thinking, asking the hard questions to get ourselves out of it, rather just paddling in the water and saying it's the IMF framework and we can't. The IMF is probably going to lose patience with us. The next time that we go to the IMF, and unfortunately it does seem that we might have to, the conditions will be a lot tougher.
You've actually touched upon the question that was posed for you by a member of the audience, which was on the PTA and the Online Safety Act, except that there is a tail to the question I'm going to read out if you'd like to answer that, which says, do you expect them to be repealed or to be reformed, if not repealed completely, but to be reformed? Do you expect them to be?
Look,
the first part of the question you've already addressed.
The Online Safety Security Act is unreformable. And the JVP too, I think, accepted it in the political campaigns that preceded their ascent to power. We need to get rid of it. The raison d'etre of the Online Security Safety Act was saying it's going to look after women and children. There are 2 clauses or something like that in that act. We have laws in this country. The problem has always been with regard to implementation. You know, so as far as the PTA, Online Safety Security Act, even the reform of the Ages Department is concerned, there's one school of thought which says that, look, if all of this goes pear-shaped, goes south, these pieces of legislation are very handy and convenient for a government to deploy to crush dissent. So at one level then, the question is, how far or to what extent has the JVP leopard changed its spots?
Alan, would you like to come in and say anything?
Sure. Well, I don't have the answer to Sarah's question.
This is a discussion. You don't have to have answers.
No, I was sort of joking there. I don't know how much the leopard has changed its spots. I'm not sure that I would agree fully that that's the best way of framing it. Maybe I'm being naive, but I think the NPP is a little bit more than just a rebranding now, of the JVP, and more than just sort of a smokescreen or a kind of a pretty face on a more questionable sort of old school JVP. Only time will tell. It'll depend on what various activists and members of the government who are who are NPP, not JVP, what they do, how they, we'll see. But I would say on the PTA, just the PTA, I think it's been disappointing to see the current government not say explicitly they're going to reject the OSA, as they had promised, I believe, in the campaign, as Sarah has just mentioned, and not try to reform it, because I think all the analysts I've read and bits and pieces that I've picked up on it, it's not reformable, as Sarah says. The PTA, I think, is never going to simply be repealed. It's always going to be repealed and replaced. I mean, if it's replaced, it's going to get replaced. And the question is what it's going to get replaced by and how fast. There we have a little bit of, reformers have a little bit of added weight on their side, given that the European Union is at least officially pushing for the PTA to be replaced by a more rights-friendly piece of legislation in order for Sri Lanka to continue to meet the criteria for the GSP plus trade preferences, which, in light of threatened tariffs from the United States, have taken on even more importance for the Sri Lankan economy, because exports to Europe are only slightly lower than exports to the US. And if you lose GSP plus tariff preferences, which are linked to governance criteria and human rights compliance, then Sri Lankan economy is in really bad shape. So I think there's a bit of pressure on the government from outside for economic reasons, not just reasons of morality or of good governance, to actually replace the PTA. The question is, what will it be replaced with? How much better will it be? Will it be better? There's no guarantee of that. And will the EU and the UN and other influential states and institutions really push for the replacement to be a good replacement and not simply, different but bad? So I think that will be crucial. I just add one more thing on the economy, just a couple of points. It may be hard for Sri Lankans to feel it, but actually, I think if you look at the statistics, globally speaking, relative to other countries, even now, Sri Lanka has a very low tax to GDP ratio, a very low tax burden. So I think there's still a long way to go to raise taxes more, including through wealth taxes, through luxury taxes, whole set of issues which I've continued to be surprised this government doesn't actually emphasize enough. Now, right now, unfortunately, the increase in taxes has been, a lot of it has been through value-added taxes, which hit another sort of non-progressive taxation. And there's also a crucial thing, which some tax scholars in Sri Lanka have taught me, which is that the tax administration structures need a lot of reform, which will take quite a while in order to be able to sort of administratively handle increased taxation, particularly wealth taxes of various sorts. So I think that's more a long-term strategy, and it won't address the immediate or mid to long-term sort of project. It won't immediately buy a lot of extra revenue for the Sri Lankan government. So I think there some of Sara's worries about excessive numbers of civil servants, remain true, even though I think actually, again, globally speaking, Sri Lanka's expenditure to GDP ratio is relatively low. Now, that doesn't mean there's not a lot of, people who don't produce very much in the state and, loss-making state enterprises that need to be either privatized or restructured in ways that don't lose money so much. But it's not, I think it's not just a matter of a bloated state that needs to be cut back. That would be my thought.
Mr. Amarasekera, did you want to come back and say a few things?
Yes. Just a couple of comments on two matters that Dr. Paikiasothy mentioned, and also Alan. Who is the NPP and who is making the decisions? From a personal perspective, I can say, as you said, I am the chairman of the Port City Economic Commission. I've had nothing to do with the NPP or the JVP previous to that. I know none of them. None of the members of the commission who were appointed also have had any association with them. So we were appointed by the president, presumably based on recommendations that they received from the private sector. I'm aware that the Board of Investment, the other investment arm, was also appointed in much the same way. Its chairman is a former partner of the Ernst & Young. They brought in Hans Vijaysurya, who was an exponent of the dialogue, the mobile telephone sector, to head the digitization. So pretty much most of the decisions, as I see it from where I have sat over the last 4 months, has been taken by the president. So it's not only a persona who led the party to power, but insofar as some of the key economic indicators are concerned and the positions and the appointments, all of those have been made, presumably based on recommendations that they have sought and then implemented by the president. To come back to this issue of taxation, yes, our taxation may not be the highest in the world, but the fact is the tax-paying community in Sri Lanka is one of the lowest in the world. Mm-hmm. And therefore, the black economy in Sri Lanka is what needs to be tapped. There is a limit to what you can tax the taxpayer who is already paying tax before he decides that anymore doesn't sustain his business. And it creates an environment where it becomes anti-competitive. You have a business on the side that is not paying tax, and you have a business on the side that is paying a very high tax, and you're only encouraging the non-taxpayer to thrive in his business environment. So one of the areas, and that's one of the topics I think that is on for today, what should Sri Lanka do going forward, is we should move towards a cashless society. And digitization is one of the key elements that the government of President Anura Kumara Dissanayake has spoken about. And for that purpose, under Dr. Hans Vijayasuriya, the digitization process is there. It was successful in India. We are only we are a tiny size of India. If it can be successful in India, and if it can be brought to Sri Lanka, the more cashless we are, the more the ambit becomes for there to be a more vibrant tax collection source, where the black economy also comes in and helps the recovery. So we have to bring in certain tools that will become the focal point in our path of recovery. And collecting taxes from the same source that has always been paying tax is the easiest route for any revenue collection authority to go. They are given a target. The easiest thing is that when everybody knows that outside there lies the bigger cake. So cashless society is, and digitization is two of the central pillars upon which I feel the recovery of Sri Lanka is going to be dependent on, and the sustainability of the IMF program. Whether we are going to be in a position in 3 years' time, Alan, as you said, I'm not quite so sure. And the national debt sustainability is a study that needs to be done. It's a study that is done by the private sector in respect of its own finances. And it's a thing that should be done by any government. As for the Trump tariff, yes, it will affect us. And the Trump tariff, unfortunately, does not take into account the situation of the country. I mean, it is across all borders. Sri Lanka was going to be placed not with 30% now full, but with 46%. And if that happened, much of our apparel industry would have been decimated. The only silver lining was our main competition is Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Bangladesh. They were all placed with the same tariff barrier. So we would have then been competing with the Latin American countries, Mexico, Peru, and Venezuela, and they would have probably come into a pact with the US. As a small country, if Sri Lanka were to enter into a separate trade deal with the US, then that begs the question, what do we do with our tariffs to our European partners, to our Asian partners, and to our Japanese partners? What the Trump administration does not take into account is we came out of bankruptcy or virtual bankruptcy. We are within an IMF program, and we need dispensation from this kind of tariff structure. So if it were to come to pass, it is something that would have hurt us and hurt us badly.
Okay. Professor Haniffa, did you want to come in to say something?
Yes, couple of things. Now, I just wanted to make it clear that although I am sort of not as sort of happy with the NPP's position with regards to minorities, I am fully on board in relation to the fact that I think they are the best suited to take us forward in the current climate, right? I mean, I am 100% in favor and in 100%, I mean, I have a 100% positive understanding of where we might be in 6 months with this government. I just wanted to make that clear from the perspective of minorities as well, from the perspective of, you know, changes in the North with regards to Muslims, with regards to sort of like terrorism accusations, all of that, right? I would like to state that. But the second thing is that I'm also very clear that this is a government that is very much a people-friendly government, that will look at how, you know, even the economic plan or any of these actions will affect the sort of the regular people of the country, right? I'm very confident about that as well. Now, in relation to cutting back on the sort of the public sector, for instance, I don't think that is on the government's agenda at all. And that's clear from the fact that they gave the public sector people a pay rise recently. Right? In terms of responding to the IMF, they were unable to negotiate the terms of the IMF deal, but they were able to negotiate this pay rise, for instance. Okay, and I think maybe, and I don't know if this is possible, debt, the fact that we have a really bad deal with regards to debt restructuring, and that there is really some space, as Alan said, for us to negotiate. Maybe those things will come up in connection with the tariff now. Right, that we are in a position to negotiate maybe with the IMF, given the current scenario, right? And that may be something that the government can take into account. But for me, it is disappointing that they haven't taken the IMF on and tried to renegotiate. But their argument is that they wouldn't have been able to, and that the people would have been affected by sort of a long, negotiation with the IMF on the basis of, or in terms of changing the terms, right? So these two things I really wanted to emphasize, because, Sarah's this sort of talk about this JVP appearing, spots, all of those kinds of things, I think are really dated understandings of what is happening in this country, right? And I think we really need to sort of move forward and to embrace the opportunity that we have gotten. I think it's a huge opportunity. I think these people have committed to doing certain things that I think we can push them on. And I think we really have to. And I think we owe it to sort of the constituencies that we are working with also, that we do this. And if we drop the ball on this, it's on us as well. I mean, the JVP NPP conglomerate, if you like, is inexperienced, right? And of course, they've been talking out of parliament. And when they are in parliament, they are somewhat at a loss, right? I think that's all right. I mean, it's not like we've had successful sort of administrators, successful politicians, for the history of our, since independence, right? It's not like we've had, right? And we are coming out of these awful sort of sets of rulers that we've had for like generations, right? What are we talking about? This is our opportunity, and we really need to capitalize on it, right? And all of this sort of like naysaying, I think, is really, I mean, criticism is necessary, right? And I think it's welcome. But I think we really need to also zero in on the opportunity and not drop the ball. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have less than 5 minutes, so I'm just going to give everyone a chance to say anything by way of closing remarks if they would like to. Alan, shall we start with you?
Yes. Well, thank you again for the opportunity to say a few words and to hear some interesting words from my colleagues. I think I would come down, or I think what Farah just closed with seems fair to me. I do think there is still really an opportunity on a broad number of fronts, and it's probably an opportunity that really would only have come with the economic collapse, the Aragalia, and the positioning, the emergence of the NPP to fill that space. And yeah, we shouldn't give up on it. And I think various actors, international actors, the IMF, international creditors, the UN, and all the domestic players need to really be trying to find this kind of sweet spot of nudging, criticizing, cajoling, reminding the government of its promises and of its ambitions, while being realistic and not trying to win everything. So, I mean, that's a challenge to find the right position of encouragement and criticism, nudging, et cetera. But I think there does remain a real chance, but it will require still the government to make some big choices, and which I think they haven't made, and remains to be seen what those choices are over the next few months.
Thank you. Dr. Saravanamuttu, would you like to say anything by way of closing remarks?
Well, yes. I mean, this panel discussion was about where do we go in the next 6 months, or indeed in the next 5 years, or whatever it is. And Farah, for example, says she knows where we will be because she's 100% in support of this opportunity which we must seize. Now, I am not 100% against it by any chance. I'm just trying to be realistic here in terms of providing a constructive critique. And I think if we do not do that, we are going to be sunk because the opposition is so weak. There have been times in this country where civil society, to the extent that one can talk about it, has had to serve that function of critiquing and outlining the reforms that need to be made. And that's the position that I am in. Yes, the JVP is inexperienced. They probably have their own version of civil society or whatever it is. But we can't start just making excuses for them. When are we going to see the demonstrable progress in terms of fulfilling the hopes and aspirations that brought them to this position of power? Now, they haven't lost it. But I would suggest that the trend into the future on the basis of the current political climate in the country, apart from the actions with regard to corruption, and we're only 6 months in, that there is a certain disillusionment and a disappointment creeping in. Now, when you do not have an opposition that is able to organize and present an alternative vision of the country, then you're going to get dissent, and it may well spill out into the streets and all of that. How is the government going to respond to it? Where is the plan of action? As far as the JVP, NPP conglomeration, as someone said, was concerned, in the election campaigns, they came out with broad brush strokes of where they would take this country. And we are short on time. Where is the plan of action? When they decided that they were going to resurrect the rural economy and all of that, where is the plan of action, and why is it that we haven't started seeing progress with regard to it? So, at one level, I can say that I'm cautiously optimistic, but after 6 months, and after a basic political lesson that I think is now probably a cliche, if you come in with such a big majority, you do the uncomfortable, unpopular, perhaps controversial things in those first 6 months, or else you're going to start then facing the problems that come with incumbency. How is the JVP, NPP government, in terms of its public communication? When they were in opposition, they were excellent. But here, they're not. As I said before, it has also become one of the most opaque governments. Who do we know who is taking the decisions? Who are in these committees as such? Yeah. So I think popular pressure from civil society or the general public or whatever it is needs to be maintained, not in some sort of overtly or excessively critical fashion, but constructive.
Thank you. Mr. Amarasekera, did you want to say anything by way of closing remarks?
Yes, just to again take 2 words of Dr. Paikiasothy. We have no opposition, and we have the strongest representation in parliament of any one party. So the 2 things are a dichotomy, right? No opposition and the biggest ever majority. That would have enabled the government to do anything it wanted. And yet it has not. Maybe the car is not going at the speed that you and I may want it to go. But the fact is, with all of that power, with no opposition, to use the word of Dr. Paikiasothy, if it has not rammed through legislation, it speaks to me of some form of governance. And that's important. Taking the history of Sri Lanka and some of the legislation that has come in, that is important. The fact is, going forward, in my view, there must be a partnership between the private sector and the government when it comes to the economy and its development. And quite often, legislation and regulations have passed by the lawmakers with little input from the private sector or the sectors in which it affects, much to the charging of the private sector or the sectors themselves, and then only the real discussion takes place as to whether there should be amendments to the regulations or otherwise. So in essence, the fact that everything that we might have envisaged has not taken place in the first 6 months must not be seen, I think, in my view, as anything less than, as Professor Haniffa said, people taking time to assimilate the facts, understand the situation, and then possibly taking the time to do what is necessary. Whether they get it right in the next 6 months, however, will be key. One cannot go on studying a problem forever, right? There is always a time frame. Whether 6 months or 7 months or 8 months is the ideal time, no one knows. But sooner or later, thought must transcend into action, and action must then transcend, in my terms, into revenue and into policy. And non-articulated policy, whether it's energy, whether it's agriculture, whether it's pharmaceuticals. And it needs to get then translated and then populated.
Thank you. Professor Haniffa, you have the last word.
Well, I would just like to say something about appreciate Mr. Amarasekera's input. Really important, I think, to emphasize the fact that the NPP is looking to find out a little bit more before it sort of like rushes in legislation or whatever. I mean, that's not, it's not something I know about, but I appreciate Mr. Amarasekera talking about it in those terms. So in terms of the opacity, Sarah, I'm really not clear about what that means, because, all of the committees are very public, and I'm not sure what you sort of mean by this opacity. I think it's quite clear how and what the NPP is doing. So I'm a bit concerned about your framing in those terms. But I would just like to end by saying that even in our last conversation, what I said really was that this is a new political formulation, and the sort of the frameworks that we used to think about how politics works in Sri Lanka in the past sort of several decades no longer really applies. I think we need to think about it afresh, to think about, the kinds of steps that they're taking and the way in which they're doing politics as somehow different, right? And I think if we do that, maybe we'll have a clearer picture of, where we might be even in the next 6 months. So I appreciate actually Dr. Saravanamuttu saying that he's also sort of like, very hopeful. And I think, that is the sentiment through which we should actually engage with the government also. And I think, in 6 months, we should have another conversation and see if, all of these things that we are now talking about have actually come true or not. It's a huge challenge, and I think it's, we should all be up for that challenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That is an idea for another event and in another academic term, I'm sure, which we would love to do. It remains for me to thank all of you for your time and for sharing your views for the last 90 minutes.
Let me just say a few words, Nilanjan.
Yeah, sure, Nofel, go ahead.
Thank you very much, everybody.
You need to turn your camera on. Yes,
sorry. And so thank you very much, everybody, for participating. A lovely interaction, and sort of not everybody agreed with everything that was said, which is one of the purposes of panel discussion, right? Otherwise, we'll be in an echo chamber, and that's something you want to avoid. But I really want to say that very soon we are going to have another conference like this on the issue of why the region is such a low trade region. Intra-regional trade within India, Pakistan, South Asia is one of the lowest in the world. And the question is, why is that? Of course, we know why that is. It's largely because of the Indo-Pakistan conflict. But the question is, what is it that Sri Lanka can still do in order to benefit from open trade that we might actually be able to do? And that's going to be a panel that will have lots of trade experts from Sri Lanka as well as from LSC who will participate in that discussion, and then we'd like you all to join in some of those discussions. All right, thank you very much. Thanks once again.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Nofel is referring to our next event, which is on the 29th of this month, and it is on regional trade in South Asia. And we will have speakers from Nepal, from Sri Lanka, from India, and from Pakistan on that panel. And the details are on our website. So for everyone who's interested, please do register for that. Thank you also to all of you, to members of our audience who have been so loyal in remaining with us all this while. I say this at the end of every event, so I suspect Farzana and Alan have heard me say this before, but if there is anything good that came out of the COVID pandemic, it is that all of us became technologically very savvy, and we were able to use Zoom and be able to convene these kinds of literally global panels where all of us are in different parts of the world. Yet it remains that we can't do it without the generosity of your time and your desire to share your ideas and your intellect. So for that and for this discussion, thank you very much on behalf of Professor Naufel Belkacem and on my behalf. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thanks.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.